Well, welcome. I'm Morris Foster. I'm the president of the School for Advanced Research. Welcome to today's presentation. This is our first event for this year's Humanities Festival, and this year our theme is Food for Thought. We are pleased to present Chelsea Fisher, and her title is What Can We Learn from the Archaeology of Sustainable Agriculture? And this also is this year's SAR Linda S. Cordell Lecture. Today's program is co-sponsored with the New Mexico History Museum, and we greatly appreciate the use of their auditorium tonight. I want to remind you that we have other events happening in the Humanities Festival. On Sunday, we have a Zoom webinar, a lecture on the topic of the complex cultural meanings of moral eating. And then that follows up on Monday with another webinar with the author, Michaela DeSoucy, who will lead a discussion of her book, Contested Tastes. On Sunday, October 6th, we have a lecture, Creating the Future of Food from the Nation's Capital to the Local Farmers Market. And that will be at SAR in the Dobkin room there. And then we also have a film in the Lindsig Friday at 6 p.m., which is Food and Country. And this is featuring Ruth Reichel, who you may know from the New York Times and other venues. And that will be the New Mexico premiere of that documentary. But back to today, archaeology plays an important role in the pursuit of sustainable agriculture. Modern farmers are reviving ancient techniques, such as medieval Moorish irrigation canals and Aztec-era floating gardens, to cope with environmental challenges. Dr. Fisher is going to share some valuable and often surprising insights that ancient food systems offer for today. Dr. Fisher is an archaeologist and assistant professor of anthropology at the University of South Carolina. I'd like to also then thank our sponsors for tonight, beginning, of course, with Anonymous, but also the Patricia G. Foshee Charitable Fund, Adobo Catering, Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, Founders Society members, Thornburg Investment Management, Luke and Betty Vortman Endowment Fund, Slow Food Santa Fe, Dan Marions of UBS Financial Services, REW Wealth, Santa Fe Dining, and Shiprock Santa Fe. I'd also like to recognize members of our board of directors who are here tonight. Thank you for your continued support. Events like this are made possible by generous support from our donors and members. And if you would like information on becoming an SAR member, please visit our website. And finally, if I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones and other electronic devices, and give you Dr. Fisher, Dr. Chelsea Fisher.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, great. Thank you for having me in beautiful Santa Fe. Thank you to everyone who made it possible for me to be here tonight. I'm bringing to you all a question this evening. What can we learn from the archaeology of sustainable agriculture? For me as an archaeologist, this question has captivated me, it's challenged me, and it's inspired me. Probably like many of you in this room tonight, it can be difficult to have years after year of hotter climate, droughts, hurricanes, political turmoil. What I find inspiring about my work as an archaeologist is that it allows me to access just an absolutely imaginative archive of past human responses to challenges that are really not so different from some of what we're living through right now. And when it comes to agriculture and sustainability, I find a lot of reasons for hope in looking at the archaeology of agriculture in the past. And my hope here tonight is to impart some of that hope to you as we look at this question of What can we learn from looking at the past from the Archaeology of Sustainable Agriculture? Now, before going any further, it's always worth defining sustainability or sustainable agriculture at a talk like this, now more than ever, because I find that this word sustainability has lost a lot of meaning and has a lot of different connotations to it, especially if someone is trying to sell you something, right? And so I find it important to just sort of lay out what we're talking about here. I don't necessarily agree with everything that the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization is doing, but I do like the way that they have tried to define a vision for sustainable agriculture. And they say that this vision is a world in which food is nutritious and accessible for everyone, and natural resources are managed in a way that maintains ecosystem functions to support current as well as future human needs. So when I see that current as well as future, for me as an archaeologist, that's what calls my attention, because that is an invitation into long-term thinking. But also as an archaeologist, I want to point out that it's not enough for us to just be looking ahead to that horizon. We have not entered this story from the beginning, right? We've entered it already in progress. We've inherited the legacies of food systems that have come before us, and we need to reckon with that as well. We need to have a long-term vision of sustainability that is as much attuned to what happened before we arrived as to what will happen after we're gone. And I'm certainly not the only person who's thinking about what the past can offer to this vision of sustainable agriculture. There's lots of news stories about how different organizations are utilizing ancient practices, ancient knowledge, in the work that they're doing to build sustainable agriculture. Just in the last couple of years alone, here are some of the headlines that have caught my eye. The Guardian reported that farmers in Texas were coping with unpredictability by experimenting with ancient farming styles, in this case, different sorts of rotational cropping practices. The Wall Street Journal reported last year on how different companies are purchasing carbon credits through the production of biochar. Biochar is an ancient Amazonian black earth sort of technique of this super rich organic soil that sequesters carbon. And so companies are using this to offset their carbon emissions. And farmers in Spain are reviving medieval Moorish acequias or water channels to allow them to be able to farm in drought-stricken environments. Now, with all of these examples of just these three headlines, I really think it's a good thing that these ancient techniques are being brought forward. But I think if we're just focusing on practices and techniques alone, we're really limiting what we can learn from farmers of the past, from ancient agriculture. For me, archaeology offers something much richer, something much more complex. I think when we're just focusing on these techniques and practices, we're really missing what ancient farmers can teach us about long-term sustainability. I'm going to be sharing with you research that I've been doing in Mexico, but before getting into that, I want to first give you just a taste, like sort of, let's call this a little appetizer platter, of what different archaeologists have been doing in different parts of the world to understand the complexity of agricultural sustainability in the past. So here in the southwestern United States, archaeologists have been studying ancient Native American societies that utilized irrigation in their agriculture. Even though these societies were using similar technologies and they experienced sort of similar climate change stress, they had very different responses to that climate stress. Archaeologists are finding that communities that really doubled down on their irrigation during those times of stress suffered a lot of social strife, whereas communities that held their irrigation less tightly, that were willing to decentralize, that were willing to walk away for a time from their irrigation, they managed to make it through those same times of climate upheaval with little sign of social stress. In the Andes, Tiwanaku-era raised field farms. Tiwanaku is an empire that's even older than the Inca. Tiwanaku farmers learned to build raised fields along the edges of Lake Titicaca at the border of Bolivia and Peru. They were able to farm on land that otherwise would have been underwater. And in the 1980s and 1990s, teams of archaeologists experimented with rehabilitating some of these ancient raised fields. They were able to produce surprisingly high yields of potato crops, and this attracted a lot of attention from international aid organizations, from sustainable development organizations, from governments. All those groups invested millions of dollars in trying to convince indigenous Indian farmers to take on this type of agriculture, to begin practicing it. All of those efforts ended up failing. It was so much work for the farmers. They couldn't really be convinced that it was worth their time. This was a technology that for them was not part of their indigenous tradition. It was something that had been abandoned hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. What's so interesting about this case is that archaeologists more recently have discovered that these raised fields during Tiwanaku times were not about farmer empowerment. They were used by this empire to extract surplus crops from farmers as tribute. And without meaning to, some of these efforts in the 1990s to rehabilitate these raised fields ended up recycling some of those same dynamics of extraction. I think some of the most interesting work is coming out of Greenland, where there were some Norse or Viking colonies that were founded and then ultimately fell apart around 1450. These colonies, it's now being shown through archaeology that they were coping with climate change, first by trying to practice their same Scandinavian agropastoralism. They were going through what we know now as the Little Ice Age. Things got rough. They began hunting marine seals in an effort to make their food system more sustainable. What's so interesting is that archaeologists can see that this worked for a while. At first, this was a sustainable adaptation to begin incorporating seal hunting. But when things continued to get difficult with climate change, they doubled down on seal hunting. They went all in on it, and ultimately, this left the colonies extremely vulnerable to climate change, and they were abandoned. And in Mexico City, the famous floating gardens known as chinampas, which you can still visit, sort of surviving examples of this in Mexico City today. Archaeologists who are studying Aztec-era chinampa farms have found that even though chinampas could be sustainable for generations, on the whim of the Aztec emperor, they could be completely overturned overnight. They could be turned into salt production. Generations of sustainability could be completely overturned by a political decision. Now, with all of these examples, what stands out to me is that through archaeology, we are able to activate this complex, diverse, and deeply historical view of sustainable agriculture that challenges a lot of the ways that we are told to think about sustainability today. First is that context matters. No ancient agricultural practice is going to be inherently sustainable or unsustainable in the long term. This means that just because a practice might be sustainable now doesn't mean it's always going to be sustainable forever, right? The context matters. Environmental, political, economic, social. Flexibility matters too. Farmers who are empowered to adjust and innovate tend to produce resilient food systems. This is something that consistently is showing up across different archaeological case studies. Flexibility matters. Rigidity causes trouble. And what I hope you're beginning to notice in what I've been saying so far is that with all of these elements, there's a much bigger political angle to this story of sustainability than we are often encouraged to think about. And that's why for me as an archaeologist of agricultural sustainability, what I find myself doing more and more is thinking about environmental justice. Many of the modern environmental justice conflicts that are unfolding and affecting communities in our country and our world today trace their legacies back to colonial efforts to dismantle ancient agricultural systems. And this has really been the focus of my work. I think that when we are able to align archaeology with environmental justice frameworks, that's when we can really activate the application of past agricultural systems. It's not so much about uprooting single technologies and trying to practice them in the present. I really don't think that works. Unfortunately, there is no sort of silver bullet answer here. Instead, what we're left with are much more complicated, but I think ultimately much more rewarding sets of lessons. So I'm going to be talking about environmental justice and specifically environmental justice conflicts, and I've included here some images of some of the most famous environmental justice conflicts here in the United States that you might be familiar with. What this term means is just talking about when the hazards and burdens of extractive land relations are inequitably distributed. So who ends up paying the price for extraction, for the development of land? And so you might have heard of mountaintop removal in West Virginia and the Appalachian communities who are left sort of with the burden that this creates. Cancer Alley in Louisiana, the toxic emissions of all these different factories and the damages that they're causing to communities there. In Michigan, the Flint water crisis. and various pipeline protests that are still going on in Virginia and other parts of the country. With all of these, there is, again, this differential shouldering of this burden. And environmental justice is a fairly new concept. Most folks, when they're talking about environmental justice, they trace its origins back to the 1980s. Following the civil rights movement, Black community leaders in Warren County, North Carolina, organized to protest the dumping of PCB, super toxic contaminated soil, in their county. And through their organizing, they began calling more attention to these disparities. And this was the start of the modern environmental justice movement in the United States. Now, even though the environmental justice movement itself only goes back, to the 1980s, something that I have found in my work is that the roots of these conflicts, the roots of environmental justice conflicts, are much older. They are rooted in these deep histories of colonialism and extraction. But when you think about it, those are precisely the histories that are often forgotten, overlooked, deliberately erased, never written at all. And so this is why archaeology plays such an important role in activating these lessons from past sustainable agriculture. When archaeology is aligned with environmental justice, this is how we can restore these critical historical perspectives back to the food system that we need if we want to figure out ways to make food not just sustainable, but environmentally just. The work that I do is at these intersections then: community-engaged archaeology, sustainable agriculture, and environmental justice. And for most of my career, so like the last 10 or 11 years, I've been working in a community called Yaxuna, located in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Today, what I'm going to be sharing with you draws on work that I did with Yaxuna community members studying ancient Maya farming at a site called Zacahuil. Can you see my mouse? You can. Which is located in the agricultural landholding of this community of Yaxuna, who are Indigenous Maya. At this site, Zacahuil, I'm going to be sharing with you archaeological research I did where we did survey, excavation, artifact analysis, soil chemistry analysis of 8 house groups and land around house groups. So what you're seeing here is a pyramid, and then this is an ancient Maya road. Scattered around this pyramid are these stone foundations for ancient houses. So these would have been the houses where Maya farmers were living. They're stone foundations that would have supported wooded and thatch structures that aren't around anymore. But because in Yucatan the soil is so thin, you can see these things on the surface and really learn a lot about ancient farmers. This is a community-engaged project that I'm going to be sharing with you. So what that means is that this was done closely in collaboration with Maya community members from Yaxuna to understand their land and their relationship to the land and how archaeology is a part of this. And this is the subject of a book that I wrote that came out last year called Rooting in a Useless Land, if you're interested in learning more about anything I'm going to talk about here tonight. There's one environmental justice conflict in particular that fascinates me in terms of archaeology and what it might be able to help us with. It's land grabbing, land dispossession. This is a conflict with deep roots. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about land grabbing, these are large-scale acquisitions of land for development. They often create negative impacts for local communities. Often land grabbing perpetuates colonial narratives about useless land. There's this idea that unless land is actively being developed for economic purposes, that it's seen as useless. So there's this sense that land needs to be taken in order to convert it from useless land, heavy on the air quotes, to useful land, right? So these are very much based in these sort of ideas of land relation grounded in extraction. In Yucatan, the way that this manifests in particular is this idea that forests are useless, that they are unused land, that they are wastelands, that they are terra nullius, which is the colonial term meaning empty land. And these are ways of interacting with land that are based in values of extraction. Indigenous Maya ways of understanding land are much more grounded in ideas of mutualism, practices of reciprocity, rather than this idea of extraction, right? The way that this shows up in Yucatan now is troubling. because some of the ways that land is being taken and converted into, quote, useful land are clearly bad, right? So taking land from a Maya community to turn it into a hog feedlot or a resort or a dinosaur theme park, which happened recently, it's not hard to see maybe that's bad. What troubles me, though, are a lot of the culprits in these instances of land grabbing are green energy projects. So for the development of wind farms and solar fields, these are connected to claims of being sustainable, but they still undermine long-term indigenous environmental justice and food sovereignty. And from the very beginning of colonialism, Maya people have been organizing to resist this, right? So here you're seeing an image of indigenous Maya water protectors who are protesting land grabbing in the capital city of Merida. And with this idea of resistance, I want to pull in a quote from indigenous scholar Eve Tuck and Marcia McKenzie. They write that the most important aim in recasting land as property is to make it ahistorical in order to hack away the narratives that invoke prior claims and thus reaffirm the myth of terra nullius, or empty land. What does that mean? It means that in order for this land grabbing, in order for land dispossession to happen, what first needs to happen is that history needs to be uprooted from these places, right? And so archaeology then, that's engaging with communities, offers a strategy for countering these ideas of useless land by helping restore history and relationship with those same lands that have been disregarded as useless. I'm going to show you how this fits into the story of Maya agriculture and forests. Let's talk about indigenous Maya agriculture. For thousands of years, Maya farmers have practiced a set of subsistence strategies that fall on a spectrum between what we're going to call intensive agriculture and milpa agriculture. Intensive agriculture is long-term cultivation that's situated around people's houses, and we often call this sort of habitually used area the house lot, and in areas around settlements, very close to settlements. Today in Yucatan, in Yaxuna, this often takes the form of house lot gardens, where vegetables are grown, herbs are grown, fruit trees are grown. What's important about this is that it's fixed in one place. So the people who are practicing this type of cultivation, they use intensive inputs like fertilizers, weeding, protecting crops, hand watering, to make sure that they can continue planting in that same plot of land over generations. On our other side of the spectrum, we have milpa agriculture, which is also known as swidden or slash and burn. This is an extensive form of agriculture. The way that this works is that a milpa farmer walks the forest looking for an area of forest where the trees are mature. He'll cut down the vegetation on that plot of land, let it dry, and then burn it. That ash that's created restores nutrients to the soil, and this burning actually emulates natural processes of forest fires that promote forest health in the long term. After burning, the farmer will plant maize, beans, and squash, and sometimes other crops in this plot. They can plant it for 2 years, and then after that, the farmer will move somewhere else to repeat the process, and that abandoned parcel will return back into the forest. So think about this. If you have a community of farmers who are practicing milpa, you are going to need a lot of forested land. You're going to need secure, multi-generational access to forests. So pretty much since the colonial era, and definitely since the time anthropologists began visiting this part of the world, the modern emphasis has been on the milpa, with intensive agriculture playing a more supplemental role of providing herbs and vegetables and stuff, but most of the subsistence has taken place in the milpa. When we look at Yaxuna, the community where I work, something that I've noticed, even in, I've worked there since 2013, that fewer and fewer people are practicing milpa agriculture. So why is this? Why is this happening? And why is it worth our attention? I think it's important to look at because as fewer and fewer people are practicing milpa agriculture, more and more land is being seen as useless. Why is this happening? So why is this happening? One of the reasons is neoliberalization. So since the 1990s, changes in the Mexican food system and our food system here in the United States has created repercussions into milpa farming. One of these has been that it now is cheaper for a lot of Maya farmers, rather than planting and eating their own food, to instead find ways of earning cash and then using that cash to buy food at the store. And often these are not going to be as nutritional. They're not going to be as culturally significant. So it's basically like a replacement of tortillas with white bread and Coke. This is a huge part of why fewer people are farming milpa. Another reason is the pivot to tourism. This is definitely not exclusive to Yaxchina. This is happening all over Yucatan. Yaxchina is a 25-minute drive from Chichen Itza, which is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. And so a lot of people that used to farm milpa in Yaxchina now think it's worth their time more, instead of going out and trying to plant, to instead put their efforts into the tourism industry, whether that means carving souvenirs that they'll sell to a middleman who will then sell them to someone else to sell to tourists, or working in construction related to tourism. More and more people that would have been farming are now engaging in tourism. Underneath all of this, of course, is climate change. It's excruciating to see farmers in Yaxchina who still are making the best of it, who are still trying to plant milpa, lose their entire crop overnight because of the unpredictability of the weather there now that's related to these larger planetary processes of climate change. So the previous signals that farmers would have used to know when it was time to carry through these different parts of the milpa cycle are no longer reliable. Droughts are longer, hurricanes are more severe, and so for a lot of farmers, this drives them to feel like it's just not worth the risk to farm anymore. Pretty much everything I've talked about with these reasons are common across Yucatan, right? The Maya area, we could say. But Yaxchina has its own peculiar twist. The most famous celebrity chefs in the world are obsessed with Yaxchina. I don't know how many foodies we have here, but you might recognize this guy. Rene Redzepi is a celebrity chef who's the chef at Noma, which is a restaurant in Copenhagen that has multiple years won the best restaurant in the world. And he, in 2017, opened up a pop-up restaurant in Mexico called Noma Mexico. These pop-ups are temporary. He's opened them in Japan, Australia. The version in Mexico, Redzepi went around touring different Maya communities, testing food to decide what he was going to serve in his restaurant. When he went to Yaxchina, he tasted the maize and the tortillas there and decided not only was he going to bring in maize from Yaxchina for Noma, Mexico, but he also hired local Maya women from the community to make tortillas on the floor of the restaurant in full view of the guests. The guests were paying $750 per person to eat at Noma, Mexico, and the 7-week pop-up sold out almost immediately. Rene Redzepi was not the first or only celebrity chef to be involved in Yaxchina. I don't know how familiar some of these names will be. Again, it depends on how many foodies you are putting up with in your household, but you've got Rick Bayless. David Chang filmed an episode of his show Ugly Delicious there. We've got Redzepi, of course. And then during the pandemic, Netflix released an episode of its show, Chef's Table, featuring Rosalia Chaichuk, who's a woman from Yaxchina, who was one of the tortilla makers at Redzepi's restaurant. This has really changed the calculus of farmers in Yaxchina when they're thinking about whether or not they should farm and how they should farm. And what this has resulted in is that Yaxchina maize has never been more celebrated and yet never been more vulnerable at the same time. Why is this? What are the sort of ripple effects of this? So those celebrity chefs that I was talking about, they've partnered with sustainable agriculture organizations who are really upset about the burning piece of milpa agriculture. So remember how I told you that the burning is actually emulating natural processes of forest regeneration. These are controlled burns that indigenous Maya farmers have practiced for thousands of years. These sustainable agriculture nonprofits and organizations have condemned that as a generator of climate change. they fail to distinguish between the burning of milpa farmers and other forms of industrial deforestation, or forms of industrial deforestation like ranching, plantations. And what they promote instead is a reinvented version of milpa agriculture that honestly I don't think you can even really call milpa, where they promote no-burn milpa, where there are fixed plots located in the town of Yashuna that stay in one place and are certified organic. These plots utilize fertilizers. Again, they stay in one place, and they are exclusively using land-race maize, which is like an heirloom kind of maize that most Maya farmers in Yashuna are no longer using. So what this means then is that this emphasis is being put on fixed plots, not in the forest. We have no-burn maize being marketed as sustainable, while traditional milpa is condemned as unsustainable. And all this means is that that forested land is being seen as useless, just at a time when interest in privatization is growing, just at this time when developers are coming every year to Yashuna to try and see if they can buy some of these lands that are at the edges of the agricultural landholding. Now, to be clear, that so-called sustainable maize, it's not staying in Yashuna. It's being sold to high-end restaurants and boutique tortilla mills. And that maize, that special maize that people in Yashuna cannot afford to eat themselves, has become the maize that is most economically viable. Traditional milpa is seen increasingly as a risk. I don't think that celebrity chefs meant to do this. I don't think that sustainable agricultural initiatives meant to do this. But the result is that by condemning milpa agriculture as unsustainable, these chefs have unintentionally contributed to that useless land narrative, to this idea that these forests are not worth holding on to. When we call just one of these, then, sustainable, these fixed plots that are not moving, that aren't utilizing any burning, when we call those sustainable and milpa agriculture unsustainable, we are making sustainability ahistorical and apolitical, which if you remember from the examples I shared with you at the beginning, we know through archaeology that sustainability is not that way. I think, though, that archaeology can challenge these ideas, these narratives, by conducting community-engaged archaeological research in precisely those lands that are deemed useless. So this map is showing you, here's the town of Yashuna. Here's a famous archaeological site, an ancient city, confusingly named Yashuna, but spelled slightly differently. Way out here, at the eastern edge of the ejido, or a collective agricultural landholding, are the archaeological ruins of this ancient Maya farming village of Zacahuil. Now, back when more people were farming milpa, this whole forested area was seen as super valuable because farmers were going out there all the time to plant. Barely anyone anymore goes out to Zacahuil. So people, it took some getting used to drive. It took half an hour in a truck to get out here to work on the archaeological project. But I began to see that precisely because this land is seen as useless, this makes it a compelling area to look at how agriculture has changed through time and people's ideas about land have changed through time. So I'm going to be sharing with you some of the results found through archaeology at this ancient Maya farming village. Just to zoom out for a second, what we were able to learn from working there is that there were two settlements separated by a period of abandonment. The first occupation was in a period archaeologists call the late determinal formative. So this is a pretty broad time period. It was probably around 1 to 250 CE. There was a period of widespread drought around 250 that led to the abandonment of this site. And then people came there again to live a few hundred years later. This time when they came, they were living at the time of, you might have heard of the Maya collapse, which was related to climate change. A lot of cities were abandoned. So this was what was going on the second time it was settled. While these lands where Zacahuil is located are rarely formed today, there's a lot of interest from developers who want to buy this land. So it's an interesting place to think about these ideas of useless versus useful. So some of the work that I'll share briefly with you about, we did a traditional ecological knowledge-based survey of Zacohuil with Yashuna farmers and gardeners. We excavated Zacohuil houses and monumental architecture. We did excavations and soil chemistry in the land around houses at Zacohuil. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is a little bit different, and it's about how eating together on archaeological projects can also challenge some of these ideas. Traditional ecological knowledge is a concept emerging in environmental studies that talks about people's multi-generational relationships with particular places and the forms of knowledge that develop through those close intimacies. I'm from New Jersey, and so I'm not really familiar with how Maya farmers and gardeners understand land, but I'm very lucky in being able to work with community members from Yashuna who have deep familiarity with this land. And so for this survey, what we ended up doing was bringing in 4 Maya men who are experienced farmers and 2 Maya women who are gardeners to walk the archaeological site around each of these ancient houses to get a better sense of the agricultural potential that would have existed in the past. I'm going to share just a few video clips just to give you a sense of what this looked like. The audio on these is not great, but it's just to sort of give you a taste of what it was like to walk in the woods as part of these surveys. No es bueno. Apenas se las bueno.
La tierra cada vez que llueve o llueva, ¿no? Se va destruyendo toda la tierra. Sí, eso creo que afecta el campo.
Through walking this landscape with Maya farmers and gardeners, we were able to completely transform the archaeological map to better reflect differences in agricultural potential. One of the main things that we noticed was this patchwork of areas that are rich in soil as opposed to areas of exposed bedrock, which, as I mentioned, in Yucatan, soils are very thin, and it's really common to have exposed bedrock. Both bedrock and soil play an important role in agriculture. And so what we were able to create then is a map that more accurately reflected where these soil-rich areas are. And what we began to notice is that the houses from that earlier settlement tend to focus on soil-rich areas. That became important. We excavated houses where farmers lived in the past, as well as the pyramid that sort of formed the anchor of the site. So here you're seeing an image from excavating one of these houses. For this part of the research, I was really drawn to anthropological ethnographic work on smallholders, living farming communities who practice agriculture that's based in their settlements, located around their homes over generations. That type of agriculture, that more intensive place-based farming, carries certain types of material signatures, which we were able to identify archaeologically at this site. So some of what this multi-generational rooting in these places looks like archaeologically are the placement of heirlooms in house construction. It looks like renovations of houses to expand over time to allow multiple generations to live together. And what we also began to notice through looking at artifacts that were found in these houses, that there were emerging social inequalities within this community, different access levels to certain types of objects. Through an excavation in the pyramid that's in the Zacohuil archaeological site, we were able to collect evidence for changing agricultural practices through time by noticing differences in the fill of the pyramid. So looking at the ways that construction episodes, the gathering of soil and stones, convey information about what was going on agriculturally around the pyramid because of the importance of stone gathering in preparing land for intensive cultivation. We excavated trenches around the houses looking for signs of intensive cultivation, and we incorporated soil chemistry analysis just to give you a glimpse of what this looked like, we were able to track out differences in soil depth, which is closely related to different agricultural practices, and look for concentrations of certain chemicals like phosphate, carbonate, pH that can be correlated with agricultural intensification through the spreading of fertilizers and discard of waste. All right. What can we learn then about these useless lands through archaeology? What stands out the most, all right, is the importance of flexibility in navigating times of climate stress. This is an artist's representation of what Zacohuil might have looked like during the first settlement. What we found at this settlement are signs that these farmers were practicing an intensive type of cultivation around their houses. They had these plots close to their homes in soil-rich areas that were used for cultivation. So at that point in this site's history, this emphasis from the spectrum was on intensive agriculture. They were investing in these multi-generational permanent commitments to particular places, particularly soil-rich places on this landscape. But over generations of entrenching themselves in these places, we noticed the development of social inequalities. There were severe droughts at the end of this period that led to this site's abandonment. I don't think that it's necessarily the case that intensive agriculture became unsustainable, but because of these social inequalities, I think the situation became unviable and farmers left. Zacohuil was abandoned. Hundreds of years later, when people came back, they had an entirely different way of living and interacting with the landscape. In this version of the artist's reconstruction, the pyramid has been abandoned, so it's being reclaimed by the forest. And the evidence that we found archaeologically is much more consistent with milpa agriculture, houses that were not occupied for as long, and the emergence of temporary shelters that are consistent with what we see for modern milpa farmers. So in the second period, farmers are switching over to this other end of the spectrum, to milpa agriculture. What's so interesting about this is that this is consistent with what has been found archaeologically at other rural Maya villages during this time of climate stress, political upheaval, that is often known as the Maya collapse. While cities were being abandoned, rural villages like Zacohuil appear to have made it through with little sign of upheaval. This seems then to underscore this point that I introduced earlier, that flexibility is what really matters, that it's the ability of farming communities to adjust their practices, to embrace this more flexible milpa style of agriculture where they're moving around in the land, that allowed them to be more resilient. So if we bring this back to celebrity chefs, when these chefs and sustainable agriculture organizations are declaring one kind of agriculture sustainable, again, they're really missing how political and historically contingent sustainability really is. Rather than calling one of these sustainable and one of these unsustainable, what this long view of archaeology helps us see is that what really matters is when Maya farmers are able to be flexible, to adjust their strategies along this spectrum rather than any one of these strategies being better than the other. What matters is their ability to change between them, which makes this a matter of land sovereignty. Land like Zacohuil now that appears useless may not be useless in the future. But if that land is sold, if that land is privatized illegally or legally, it ends this conversation. It ends this ability to move along the spectrum, to adapt. It puts a block in this ongoing conversation that has been going on for hundreds of years between Indigenous Maya farmers and these forests. So with all of that I've just talked about, I'm really showing you how we can look to our collective human archive for these examples, right, from history that challenge our views of sustainability today. The last thing I want to talk about is how actually just the practice of doing archaeology can also challenge some of these ideas about useless land. And this is eating together in the field. So I mentioned that Zacohuil was out sort of a way away from the town where we were staying, where these people live. And most people who work on archaeological projects in Yashuna have some experience working there. There's been archaeology going on there since the 1980s. People are used to working closer to town, which means when it's lunchtime, they can go into town and buy a cold Coke or have, their wife bring them lunch. But at Zacohuil, it was kind of more difficult because we were out there. It took half an hour just to drive out there. So if you forgot something, that would be difficult. What this led to then was a new style of eating on the archaeological project where people involved began coordinating to bring out food to share together. So for a little while, I sort of clung to my granola bars as a creature of habit, Nature Valley, I wasn't going to give you up. But, it didn't take long after being invited to eat these meals that I, left the granola bars in my backpack and began eating. And every day it was different. And every day it got more and more elaborate, especially when we began documenting what we were eating every day. And so these lunchtimes turned into like these hour-long feasts where we would just, there was a lot of gossip about like what was going on at Rene Redzepi's restaurant and how the women who were making tortillas had never slept in beds before. They were used to hammocks, and this was like blowing everyone's mind. We were talking about this. We were eating really good food and talking about why people don't really come out to Zacohuil to farm anymore. I found that through these practices of eating together, it created opportunities for restoring history to this land that otherwise people would not have been at, right? And it also created openings for new stories to form. I'm going to share one with you, my favorite story, about how this so-called useless land would create invitations to eat that were unexpected. So we were driving back after a very long day. It was very hot, and I'm driving the pickup truck. I have two viejitos, two old men next to me, and maybe 6 guys in the back of the truck going over the bedrock, when all of a sudden I hear on the back of the truck, stop. Okay, so I stop the truck. Someone comes over and he says, Chelsea, just wait here. Don't get out of the truck, just wait here. We have to go get something. So I say, okay. So me and the viejitos were staying in the truck. I'm sort of slumped over the steering wheel waiting when all of a sudden I hear a mix of screaming and laughing. And I pop up and I look in the rearview mirror and I see these 6 men sprinting down the path through the forest to the truck saying, start the truck, start the truck. And they're holding aloft what looks to be this football made out of brown paper. It's a wasp nest. And there is a cloud of wasps just chasing them. Chelsea, start the truck. It's a stick. So I'm trying, and they're jumping in and leave him, no, get him in. So everyone gets in, we drive away, we make it out, and we're fine. It had that feeling, when you're already living in what is going to be a memory that's repeated as a story. It had that feeling, but it solidified the next day when we had the feast of Shush Ek, which you're seeing here in this little Tupperware. What they did was they took the larva out of the wasp nest, they toasted it on a hot comal or griddle, ground that up, mixed that with chili and sour orange juice, and created shush ek, which is a traditional Maya food that is not something you eat every day. It's certainly not something you can get in a convenience store, but it was a food that they knew how to make, was important to them, was unexpected, and allowed this opportunity to reclaim a relationship with land where otherwise there would not have been one. And I think that this is what continues to inspire me through the work of archaeology, that through these practices, through these relationships, we have a chance to reaffirm social connections to land and to push back against these ideas that land is useless through the power of food, through the power of eating together. I brought a question to you. What can we learn from the Archaeology of Sustainable Agriculture? Here's what I want you to take away from this. Agricultural sustainability, it's political and it's historically contingent. The context really matters. The context really matters. Even well-intentioned agricultural sustainability efforts can undermine long-term environmental justice if they misrepresent or ignore that context. I don't think the chefs or the sustainable development organizations that are calling MILPA unsustainable mean to perpetuate these narratives, but we need to have a critical eye when we're looking at the ways sustainability is being sold to us, right? When it's being used to brand something that we're supposed to buy. And I find hope, and I hope I have given you some hope, in seeing ways that community-engaged archaeology offers meaningful possibilities for pushing back against that erasure of context when it is aligned meaningfully with long-term environmental justice. And so with that, I thank you for having me here and for listening. Thank you. I will also say, if you're interested in reading any of this work or seeing sources or just links to learn more, feel free to scan that QR code.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, sorry. My name is Brittany Goodrich. I'm the membership coordinator at the School for Advanced Research. I have a master's in food culture and communication, so they asked me to lead the Q&A tonight. I just want to thank everyone for being here, and Chelsea for that very thought-provoking talk. It gave me a lot to process. I don't even know if I fully have yet, but one of the main questions that came to mind was I was wondering if you have any thoughts after your experience and your research on how to apply what you're learning in that particular context to like the larger world, and especially like a country like the US where we don't, well, we have native knowledge, but I guess a lot of it has been erased already. And so how do you apply that in modern times, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a program that, if you're interested in learning more about this stuff, I'd encourage you to look at it's the Food and Agriculture Organization's, Globally Important Agricultural Heritage Systems, GIAs, as I call it with my students. It's a program that celebrates agricultural heritage in global context. Countries nominate agricultural systems that have been around for a really long time for protection through the United Nations. The United States has none that are recognized through this program. And that's not because we don't have any. It's because our country hasn't taken any of these steps to nominate and participate in this program. I think that here and in every country, there's a very particular relationship to the past and also to indigenous forms of agriculture and the ways that those are either celebrated, protected, erased, dismantled. And so for thinking about this in the United States context, for me, it's really important when I'm teaching about this or talking with people is encouraging this sort of critical view of sustainability. I'm really interested in the ways that different marketing strategies will try to sell us food that invokes narratives of the ancient past. The biggest offenders in this regard are quinoa, chia seeds, other ancient grains. But encouraging people to really question the way that sustainability is marketed to us. And I think that that's something that here in the United States and really anywhere, given how globalized our food system has become and is continuing to become, helps, I think, cultivate that sort of sense of a more critical political view of sustainability. Yeah.
So I'm going to turn over to the crowd. If anybody has any questions, please raise your hand. And Mary will bring the microphone over to you.
Can I take this out and hold it? Would that work? Does that work?
Thank you. Chelsea, I've been looking forward to your visit. This is Camilla.
Hi.
We've been communicating, and I'm really grateful that you're here. I wanted to ask you to state the name of that organization again. In northern New Mexico, as you know, we have old acequia systems. We have an integration of prehistoric and historic agriculture that literally in my lifetime we grew our food because Dad wasn't going to have it any other way. And I've watched a lot of change, and this is very important to where we are right now. I'm very interested in the name of the organization that you just mentioned.
That I just mentioned? So it's the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and then GIA GIHS, Globally Important Agricultural Heritage Systems. Rolls right off the tongue. And I'm not like totally in support of this program, because when these heritage agricultural systems receive status as one of these sites, it's very much linked to like finding ways for them to be economically productive, and often that involves tourism, right? So some of the most breathtaking agricultural systems in the world, the Ifugao rice terraces in the Philippines, Chinampa agriculture, lots of Andean agriculture. There's fascinating examples of this. And yeah, when students ask me like, why doesn't the United States have any? I say that there's plenty of examples that could be nominated. I think about like waffle gardening and different types of dryland farming that developed here in this part of the world. That would be, I think, excellent candidates for that if people were interested in putting that together.
About the outmigration, when you showed the drawings, what type of population change when the population left? And I want to do. It can be understood through the archaeological work that you did to move from the intensive to the milpa. Did they die off? Did they move to other areas? What did you see, or what were you able to identify?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that when they were practicing intensive farming at Zacahuil, there were 5 house groups that were settled at that time. And I think that probably about 10 people would have been living at each of those. So this is still a small settlement of maybe 50 or 75 people at the most. When it switches over to milpa agriculture, it's many fewer people are living there, and there's a lot more movement. So places are occupied for shorter amounts of time, and it seems like people are moving around a lot more than they were previously, which is consistent with this milpa form of agriculture. In general, I think it's important to remember, if you hear about the Maya collapse, Maya people, didn't all die out. I think that that's a sort of sin of some of the ways that this has publicly been talked about. Maya farmers just left these cities and went out to farm. It was an act of just, resistance and no longer wanting to put up with kings. And so people left. So this idea of it being a collapse or as a bad thing, I think we're challenging that view too, because it's much more complicated than that. And yeah, farmers being able to walk away and live on their own is not necessarily a bad thing. And I'm sorry I couldn't make it out this morning. I had some altitude sickness.
Thank you. So I do a lot of work in the energy transition and a lot of the geochemistry associated with that. And I definitely see, there we go. I do a lot of work in the energy transition, and I definitely see a lot of the environmental impacts that has extraction of materials, rare earth elements that we need for a lot of the renewable energy sources and things like that. And I'm wondering, based on what you've learned from this kind of work, do you have any thoughts on how we can marry the energy ideas that we have for energy transition with environmental and agricultural sustainability and stewardship?
It's a great question. In the case of Yucatan, what I have seen in the research I've done is that the sort of protocols are already there on paper of what should be happening. So consultations with communities, lots of meetings with them, making sure that materials are translated into languages that people understand. So in a lot of these communities, most will speak Spanish, but many won't. They'll speak Maya. And so there are steps laid out for how this should be happening, but in practice, often it's not, right? And so these energy companies will lie about holding meetings or forge signatures of landowners, and landowners won't even know that this is happening. So the good news is that I think that there are already models out there for what these consultation processes can look like, and not just consultation so much as partnerships, right? Thinking about how communities will benefit from this type of work, rather than them just completely missing out. I think about biodiesel, biofuels, which in Yucatan has contributed to some of this land grabbing, where farmers are convinced to sell their land for biofuel plantations that they are told are going to give them secure jobs for a number of decades or whatever. And then within a few years, the startup capital is gone and these places are just abandoned. So thinking about, partnerships as opposed to just maybe this transactional consultation model, but it's such an important question. I don't think it's definitely not an easy one, but it's urgent, right? It's a great question.
Hi, Chelsea. Thank you for a terrific talk. Someone who's had the pleasure of eating wasp larvae, I wanted to ask you an Amazonian question. In my case, I was clearing a field with some community members, and my machete hit the nest, and my left hand was about the size of a softball, and the guys I was with said, "You got to eat that," to show who's boss.
But you did.
You mentioned the Amazonian case, and as you know, thanks to the work of Anna Roosevelt and others, we now know that the riverine populations of the Amazon actually created the soil. So
Yes.
through a mixture of charcoal, potsherds, human wastes, and other organic materials. Did that actually take place in the communities you're looking at, or in other parts of the Yucatan, or was just the chemistry and the climate sufficiently different that it didn't really happen?
Yeah, it's a great observation there. So, and I'm guessing that some people might not be familiar with this, but so the Amazon is kind of a classic case of colonial views of land being that it's empty wasteland. In the case of the Amazon, it was seen as this sort of pristine, virginal rainforest, but archaeologists who have been working there have recognized the presence of this biochar, terra preta, black earth. Amazonian dark earth is often a name, where precisely as you're saying, it's this, we still don't fully understand how they were making it. It's some combination of different wastes, fish matter, all sorts of just very organic, rich materials that are going into this making of this earth, but that would have enabled ancient Amazonians to farm in the Amazon. And archaeologists are just now beginning to recognize just how widespread Amazonian dark earth is. There are scholars who have developed a similar model for the Maya dark earths, MDEs as they're known, that's also looking at this sort of creation of black soil. I mentioned the site of Yaxtruná, which is a much bigger site in this community's landholding, where I've also done some work. One of the things that I've noticed there, but I haven't yet written about this, is that you can see a switch over to black earths in the stratigraphy, in these layers of these excavations, that I think could be seen as the production of what you're talking about, of this kind of organic, rich, dark earth. It's both a byproduct of human occupation, but it's also an enabler of human occupation, because it's allowing for cultivation, and it's also sort of just the result of people living there and building up of all of these different organic refuse over time. So yes, there are exciting reasons to think that Maya people were doing something similar. And in the Maya case, we're learning that in some of these big ancient cities, Tikal, Caracol, that they were practicing a form of urban agriculture, which is really cool, because you can see how urban agriculture allowed these cities to develop that looked nothing like their contemporaries in the medieval European world looked like. These walled fortresses. Maya cities were sprawling and seem to have been practicing urban farming through dark earth production and other strategies.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. This may seem strange, and I admit it.
Okay.
I have not had a lifetime interest in potatoes for anything other than French fries. But about 5-6 years ago, when we moved here, I tried an experiment, which was to take the tastiest potatoes I could find at the Santa Fe farmers market and grow them for 3 years in a row. I wanted to see if they were hybridized, and I wanted to see whether it was sustainable seed stock. And it turned out within 3 years, there was almost no yield, not
Interesting.
even enough for seeds. This has led me to ask questions of people throughout New Mexico and parts of Colorado. It turns out there is no sustainable seed potato crop that I have been able to find in the entire area. They're all buying hybridized seed potatoes that within 3 years diminish to nothing. And several of the farmers at the market confirmed that. They'd tried it themselves, and in 3 years' time, they're gone.
Wow.
Now, I can assure you, I don't know Spanish. I have no knowledge of anthropology beyond being nice to people and trying to get out of their way. And
Thank you.
I have never been to the Yucatan. Once to Cozumel, but that's not really the Yucatan.
It's the neighborhood.
Are they growing potatoes where you're researching, and do they buy the seed potatoes from some distributor, or are they still using original stock?
That's a great question. I don't know. I know that they're not, I've not ever had in Yashuna potatoes that, like white potatoes. They grow forms of sweet potato there, but I have not seen the production of those on the level where maize has been. You know, they buy maize or corn seeds from companies now that are also these genetically modified seeds. So it's a really interesting question about these landrace or heirloom varieties of different seeds. And I think it's, you know, the UN released a report a few years ago that I think said that 75% of the world's population gets its food from just 12 species, like 7 plants and 5 animals. It's something like that. And out of the thousands and thousands of animals and plants that are historically our species have eaten. And so I think I'm really encouraged by efforts of seed savers and other people who are involved in protecting and reviving heirloom varieties of plants, because some of those varieties of plants have the ability to withstand drought or, you know, precisely the changing conditions that we're living through right now. So yeah, keep experimenting, and I want a French fry from one of your potatoes someday. That's really cool.
Thank you very much. It was a very stimulating talk.
Thank you.
I'm wondering about the term useless land, and perhaps I missed this, but is this a term that the people that you worked with used, or I'm just wondering where this term comes from?
Great question. It's in the title of my book, right? So my book is called Rooting in a Useless Land. And this term is not one that I think came to me from people in Yashuna in that precise wording. But they would talk about land in that it doesn't have use, or it's, you know, we never come out here. We don't farm here. There's no point in having any of this land. Why would anyone want to come out here and farm? In Yucatan, though, historically, the term terrenos baldios has been a popular one, which means empty lands. And that was often used throughout colonial history to just all of a sudden open up huge areas of previously Maya-owned land to private developers. So while useless land and useful, I think that is sort of my own framing of this. I think it's part of a longer history of seeing these places as empty or waste or useless. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, so much.